Well, one of the things that was a big sticking point in the budget discussions that were taking place in the House was funding over Ukraine. And certainly that hasn't been cleared up with the continuing resolution. And we're seeing in America, among some, especially on the Republican side, potential Ukraine fatigue. And joining me to talk about this is Laura Kelly. She's a foreign policy reporter for The Hill. Laura, thank you for coming on the DC Debrief. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
It's good to talk to you. And I know, like I said, funding a big sticking point here in these budget negotiations. The continuing resolution that was passed by Congress and the president didn't contain any Ukraine funding, and so now I know a lot in Washington who want the United States to continue to support Ukraine, be it some with direct financial aid, some only with weapons, whatever it may be. All that is kind of in limbo right now, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. I
So
mean, do you want me to?
please, yeah. So what are the next steps here? Like what is the level of concern that you're hearing about here in DC?
It's a lot of concern. It's very worrying. I mean, as far as next steps, those are really up in the air because first of all, we have to just get a new House Speaker for the Republican majority. I mean, the House can't do any work until they elect a speaker, and it's very unclear how long that will take. The government is funded until November 17th. Congress went home for this week, so they'll be coming back next week. But when they come back next week, will they have a viable candidate that can unite the conference behind that person? And can they get through an election in one vote? Or will we see a series of votes like it took for Kevin McCarthy to become speaker, which took 15 rounds? And then even once the speaker is elected, will they be able to get into all the things that need to be done to run the government, to pass the next government funding bill? And if they're going to pass the next government funding bill, what will the fight like? What will the fight be like over Ukraine aid, given that the continuing resolution, it only passed once that $6 billion request, which was far less than the President Biden's $24 billion request, was axed. And again, President Biden's $24 billion request was only meant to supplement a few months left in the year 2023. And so if it's this difficult to get money for a few months, what is it going to look like in terms of America's, what the Biden administration wants and what supporters for Ukraine, both Republicans and Democrats, want is a robust American commitment for the long term for Ukraine. So there's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that we've heard from the Republicans who are supportive of continuing to fund Ukraine is that the majority of the majority are still in favor of funding Ukraine. And do you find that to be the case?
I mean, in one respect, maybe yes, but we saw with a vote on Ukraine on a different position of assistance for Ukraine that a majority of the Republican conference voted against it. So there was a vote last week or 2 weeks ago that was for $300 million for Ukraine aid. This is a small amount compared to the billions that the United States has provided over the course of a year and a half. And this $300 million is really kind of historical assistance that the U.S. has provided since at least 2016. So this became the sticking point for Republican hardliners like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Kevin McCarthy flipped on his position. He said he was going to take that money out. He said he was going to leave it in. And then eventually he took this money out to hold a separate vote on it. Some Republican critics say that any assistance for Ukraine should really be dealt with on its own, I guess, so some people can kind of stake out these positions, whichever they think are more politically advantageous. So the vote on this $300 million showed that a majority of the Republican conference was against it. The money passed because it had the support of Democrats, but that just shows you where the trend lines are going.
What other areas of the world, what other countries that you've been taking a look at are also possibly experiencing Ukraine fatigue?
Yes, so I wrote a piece the other day about the cracks in the coalition supporting Ukraine are starting to deepen, given that, all this chaos in Washington between the fight for Ukraine, but also that it just uh, gums up the ability for the U.S. to do other priorities like fund the government. That gives other countries pause in what they should do and whether they have to increase their own funding. And for in the European coalition, Hungary has long been an outlier with Prime Minister Viktor Orban really going against the grain in terms of democratic rollbacks and fueling this populist support among his base. And he has been opposed to sending military aid to Ukraine. He has frustrated efforts within the European Union to give robust support to Ukraine. He's held back on ratifying Sweden's accession to NATO, and now there's some countries that are kind of getting on that bandwagon. We see there are elections in Poland coming up in October, and it's kind of unclear um, the real motivations of some of the remarks by Polish officials um, in the government now who are looking for re-election. They kind of started this feud with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky over grain shipments into Poland because it was a market kind of thing. They want to protect Polish farmers, so they said they don't want Ukrainian grain sold in Poland. And it kind of made this war of words. And you had the Polish prime minister saying that Poland would not send any new military assistance to Ukraine. It's unclear if they will actually follow through with that. Poland has been a really strong supporter of Ukraine, taking in about 1 million Ukrainian refugees on top of Ukrainians who aren't using services in Poland. So there's a lot of strain on the Polish public in general, a year and a half. And then we saw the recent elections in Slovakia. A pro-Kremlin politician came out on top in parliamentary elections, and that politician will be charged with trying to put together a government. So it's still unclear if the rest of the political parties in the Slovakian government will join and then give this person a platform to become prime minister. And this person, Robert Fico, has talked about ending military assistance to Ukraine, pushing for peace talks that people say are premature and between Russia and Ukraine, and just kind of gone towards a more isolationist stance.
How has the Kremlin responded to all of this growing sense that maybe there's a Ukraine fatigue going on around the world?
Yes, well, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, after I think it was the vote on the continuing resolution in the U.S. without the Ukraine aid, remarked that this was something they had expected and that they predicted that war fatigue would fracture this coalition and that countries would tire of supporting Kyiv. In their mind, it's because they think that the Ukrainians aren't worth supporting, and Russian President Vladimir Putin doesn't think that Ukraine is a real country. So that's the message that they're pushing out there.
And Ukraine, for their part, are they aware, or do they have a sense that there's some fatigue going on? And if so, what kinds of things are they doing to continue to rally support?
Yes, I think I think there's definitely an awareness that they realize it gets harder and harder to rally the support of the coalition to help them. And so Ukrainian President Zelensky, I mean, he took a trip to Washington to really have face-to-face meetings and really implore people personally on the importance of supporting Ukraine in this moment. But looking to the long term, Ukraine is looking to increase its own capacity to build weapons, and not only build weapons for its own use, but then be able to export them as well, as we see a lot of militaries that have supplied Ukraine needing to refill their own stocks. So maybe kind of a new military industrial base within Ukraine. But that really can't happen until Ukraine has total control of its skies. It can defend against Russian air attacks. And for that, it needs fighter planes like the F-16s that are making their way there at some point, and increased air defenses. That's what they're really looking for as well.
And Laura, last thing on this, President Biden obviously has been hearing some of the criticism, especially from those on the right in the House who are growing more resistant to funding Ukraine. Certainly not without some kind of exit strategy or goals or end times or some of the guardrails that some of those folks want to have in place. He's preparing a major speech on Ukraine. He made that announcement this week. As of the time we're speaking, we don't know exactly when that's going to be, but what are some of the things you're expecting to hear from him when he does make this speech?
I think President Biden will kind of strike a balance between the practical nature of supporting Ukraine and the symbolic nature of supporting Ukraine. Practical because it pushes back against really a violation of international norms, where Russia launches this invasion of a sovereign country with absolutely no justification, and this country has asked for help. And in the U.S. and national security interest to push back against such Russian aggression and Russia's disregard for how the world really operates. This is a good value, a good investment, a good return on investment, in that the U.S. is sending weapons directly from their own stockpiles, and we're passing money to then replenish our stockpiles. So now maybe in turn we're updating our military capacity, and with no cost to American lives compared to other wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and historically. So there's the practical nature of it. And then the symbolic nature of it is, what I've been hearing from people abroad is that if America isn't there, America, the most powerful country in the world, like who is there to stand up to a bully? And what do having values actually mean if we're not prepared to defend them? And Ukraine is a democratic country. It has fought very hard for its democracy, and it has its problems, namely corruption, but it's working towards fixing those all the time. And if we don't stand with those countries, then what kind of world do we want to live in? So I think it's going to be this balance between hearts and minds.
Yeah. Well, if you want to read everything Laura Kelly is writing about Ukraine and her foreign policy beat that she covers over there at The Hill, make sure you go to The Hill and check out their work every day. They really do a great job covering this stuff, as well as everything going on Capitol Hill and across the country. Thank you so much, Laura, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.